Okay, now we're going to explore the world of smell. Smell and taste are considered chemical senses because chemicals from the environment impinge on the receptors. So in the case of taste, you have actual chemical substances that are in your mouth that are influencing the receptors there. With smell, you have chemical substances that are in the air that impinge on receptors up in your nose. When you eat something, both smell and taste work together. So the flavor that you experience is a combination of smell and taste. Now, obviously, when you just smell something, taste isn't going to contribute to the sheer smell of something. But when you consume something and you're smelling and tasting it together, you're getting a combined perceptual experience that comes from both of those. Okay, well, humans are not really good smell detectors. We're not really good at detecting small changes in smell. We clearly are reasonably good. I mean, you can smell a quite diverse amount of things, and you can make distinctions between things by smell. And obviously, smell still contributes to our eating behavior. So you usually will smell an apple to make sure it's ripe before you eat it, or make sure it's not rotten before you eat it. But other animals, especially those that have stayed close to the ground, like dogs and rodents and other mammals that explore the ground on four legs, they have excellent smell systems. And probably we had a smell system that wasn't that far off back when we were mammals of that sort. But during the course of evolution, as we have gone up into the trees, as primates, and especially since we've stood up off the ground, there isn't as much material to smell as there was before. And the smell, the chemicals that are in the air aren't really good at telling us the location of a source of a smell, things like that. Whereas a dog, when they're tracking prey, can track prey based upon the smell that's on the ground. We can't do that, or they can't do that also with smells that are in the air. So smell has become a bit vestigial in us. It's become less developed in us because we don't use it so much. Smell is a very primitive perceptual system. It's something that goes directly into the brain, does not go to the thalamus. That's an important thing about smell. It's so primitive that it goes directly into the limbic system and other parts of the frontal lobes that are used to associate the smell with other sensory experiences. But smell has a really strong motivational force. Taste does as well, but smell even more so. Smell is about motivating us to act. It's about motivating us to seek out things that are related to food smells, avoid things that might be harmful and things like that. And it has an implicit emotional, aspect, which we all know when we, smell perfumes and smell flowers, and we can tell there are pleasant things to smell and unpleasant things to smell. And that pleasant, unpleasant, those feelings are automatically associated with different smells. We may even have genetically pre-programmed certain smells. I don't think that's been studied very much, but it's certainly a possibility since smell is so hardwired into the brain. Now, an important aspect of the receptor system in smell is that smell sensitivity is based upon the number of receptors you have and not the sensitivity of the receptors. So a dog has a large number more, 100 times 300 to 10,000 K more sensitive because the dog has so many more. A dog has about a billion receptors in its nose, whereas we only have about 10 million. So the dog sensitivity comes from a number of receptors and not by having a more sensitive or more developed system. They just have more of them. Finally, I have the term anosmia on this slide that indicates the loss of smell. That's an important thing clinically when you do work especially with patients that have brain trauma. The smell system is right there at the base of the brain, and the receptors go right into the brain from there. And unfortunately, when you have traumatic brain injuries, you can shear that right off. And so the brain, when it rocks forward in an accident, will cut right through the smell system, and people will lose their smell. People also born without smell, born anosmic. The interesting thing about this is that people who have anosmia after, say, a traumatic brain injury, they might, if they were tested, or they might spontaneously, say, well, I don't seem to taste my food the same way I did before. They might comment, or they might discover if they don't have any smell if they had some way to actually examine it. Especially if they were in some kind of a job where ordinarily smell would be important. And that could be anything from, obviously, if you made perfumes, smell would be important. But it's also important in food handling. It's important in if you prepare food. It's important in a lot of industries in which the chemicals used in industries are part of the work environment that people typically smell. So when they go back in there after their injuries, they don't smell those things, and they think it's kind of funny. But again, because most people don't think of the brain being the source of function, people think, well, I know I had a brain injury, but there's nothing wrong with my nose. So they don't correlate the loss of smell with their brain injuries. And they have to be tested later and to be discovered if they have smell or not. Fortunately for humans, smell is not that important in terms of survival value. A lot of neuroscientists study smell. It's a very interesting thing to study. A few years ago, neuroscientists won the Nobel Prize for figuring out how smell works in humans. Clearly there's an industry of perfume and everything, that those people would be out of job if people didn't smell anymore. But you can get along fine in today's modern life, with vision, hearing, and the other senses. And smell, you can live without it and not experience a major impairment or deficit in adapting to the world. But anosmia is the formal term for loss of smell sensation. Okay, I have a movie at the website in which a dog is used to smell drugs in a prison. So go play that movie, and you'll get a real good feeling for the difference in sensitivity between your smell system and that of a dog. Okay, well, the receptor system for smell is in the mucus that lines the top of your sinus there. Now, again, an important principle is that neurons cannot live out in the air, so they can't live in the sinus itself, in the air. They have to live, and the receptors have to live in the mucus. There has to be a fluid space, a fluid environment in order for them to survive. So once again, you have this interface between the air on the outside and the fluid and colloidal, fluid-filled spaces of your where your brain is and your body. And especially with smell, because you're dealing with chemicals that are actually in the air. So that you've got a problem. How do we get these chemicals in the air to influence a receptor system that's in fluid? And so that's how these receptors are basically designed. They set in between the bone there at the base of your skull into the mucus that constantly lines the olfactory system there, the olfactory sinuses. And you can see there's a bulb there, the olfactory bulbs. If you look at the bottom of the brain, you'd see these bulbs very prominently there. And you can see where there are processes extending from the receptors in the olfactory mucosa up into the olfactory bulb. That's the basic layout, and now we'll go into this in more detail. Okay, so this illustration shows the receptor sitting there in the mucosa. So you have the olfactory receptive cells. Notice that they've been color-coded, different colors. So you have the red ones there, the green ones, and the blue ones. Now later we'll talk more about what this means, but you've got this segregation of receptors by types. Now you can see here that if you look in the illustration at the very bottom, where they're showing a blow-up, of the base of a receptor, what you have are two types of receptors that are going to respond differently to different chemicals. Okay? So if you imagine this, if you look at this, it looks quite similar to how a neuron is structured at the synapse. And you have neurotransmitters that are activating channels. Now here you've got a similar system. I don't want to overstate this, but you've got a similar system in which molecules in the mucosa, which come from the air, are going to stimulate these receptors in a similar way that neurons are stimulated by neurotransmitters. Now the receptors have been, over the course of evolution, have been tailored for different classes of substances. And so there you see the odorant molecules down there. The red ones, the red type of odorant molecule, stimulates the red receptor. And green type stimulates the green receptors. Then these are going to convey impulses to the glomerulus, which contain neurons, formal neurons. These neurons are going to be synapsing with the receptors, and you can see them synapsing by clusters. This is what won the Nobel Prize, figuring this out, that these clusters of glomeruli and the way in which they respond to different substances gives us our smell sensitivity. Now, if you look at this system, though, you can see that, here's the guy up there smelling lilacs, it looks like. lilacs are going to be putting out a bunch of different molecules. And our smell system is only going to be sensitive to a certain class of them. Our brain is going to take that information and form a perception of lilac smell. Now, lilac smell, that perception, does not exist in the lilac. It only exists in your brain. So your brain is constructing smell sensations, smell perceptions out of information it's getting about molecules that have been given off by the flower. Now, presumably, other animals smell the lilac differently than we do. So a bee, which for the lilac is a much more important animal to smell the flower than humans. I mean, after all, humans just pick the flowers. The bees pollinate them. They want to attract bees and butterflies and other animals that pollinate. They don't want to attract us. The bee will smell something different because its smell system is going to be sensitive to different molecules coming off that flower than our smell system. The point is that the smells are constructed by the brain, just like colors are constructed by the brain, and pitches are constructed by the brain. They correspond to an environmental condition, but the environmental condition is not the smell. The smell is a conversion of the information coming from the object into a perception. All that the object's doing is secreting or transmitting molecules in the air that it knows attracts bees and insects that pollinate it. It doesn't even know that. Over the course of evolution, through natural selection, that's occurred. And the flower is just secreting molecules. We perceive those molecules as the odor of the flower. Okay, here's a schematic that shows in more detail about how receptors work. So you've got a receptor sitting there in the mucosa. It's obviously a cell that has a membrane in it. And then in that membrane are receptors that look almost the same, or they're very similar to the ion channels that you see in a neuron itself. And these are basically constructed by taking these long protein chains, weaving them in and out of the membrane in a certain pattern, a certain configuration, that allows certain ions to either stay in the cell or stay outside the cell, or when the gates open by neurotransmitter influence, these ions flow into the cell or out. So these protein molecules form these patterns, these channels in the receptors, and they're going to respond to different kinds of chemicals that are in the mucosa. Okay, this slide depicts what I just described in the other one, as well as some more numbers about how many receptors we have. Okay, the olfactory receptors, the ORs, are part of the membranes of cilia of the olfactory neurons. They consist of proteins that cross through the membrane, and these long protein chains enable the membrane to be tailored for different kinds of molecules passing back and forth. There are approximately 1,000 different olfactory receptors that respond to the same class of molecules. So you have a set that respond to a certain set of molecules, another set that responds to another set, and you have up to 1,000 of these different types. Now there's about 10,000 of each type of olfactory receptor neuron, getting us up to about 10 million olfactory receptor neurons total. So we have, basically the point of this is that you have different protein chains in there. You have up to 1,000 different combinations of these protein chains, and that produces the ability to detect a multitude of different molecules that come into the olfactory mucosa. When you look at this number, I'm thinking, well, I don't seem to be able to be that sensitive, in my smell. When I'm smelling something, it doesn't seem like it's that complicated, that I could probably do with far fewer types of olfactory receptors than I have. It doesn't seem like it would take 1,000 different types of olfactory receptors to smell the things that I smell. They don't seem to be that distinctive. It turns out that there probably is a fair amount of redundancy, but the odors that you form, that your brain forms, is really a composite of pretty complex patterns of these olfactory receptors responding. So the particular odor of something is, say, a lilac flower, or the odor of different kinds of food like fruit or vegetables or meat, that sort of smells. They're quite complex. They have a lot of different molecules in them, and your smell system will respond in a certain pattern for each kind of substance that comes in there. And these composite patterns produce the odors that we perceive. Here's a very simplified schematic of how overlap in these receptor types might occur. Here you've got receptors represented by the red rings, and you've got receptors represented by the blue circles, and they respond to generally different classes of substances. But then you've got a couple of these receptors that are responding to both substances. So you've got two substances, classes, and then some that respond to both. And this is going to be conveyed up to the central nervous system by a firing pattern associated with these receptors. The neurons are going to convey this to the brain, and you're going to have a perception of odor that's slightly different than if you had a pattern in which there was no overlap at all. Here you have a layout of the receptors of a frog smell system. Just part of it. You don't even have the whole system here. And you see that there's smells along the top there. So ANI, ACE, PHO, and those things are different substances that are perceived by the frog. And then down the column there you have the different receptor types in the frog smell system, and the circles represent how responsive those receptors are to the smell, to the substance. So each substance has a unique pattern of receptor types in responding. And so you see there's if you go down the first one, imagine the first one is something like the frog's water that he lives in. And you can see there are certain receptors that respond to that, the cluster of chemicals that are in water, in his pond water. And you can see some respond a lot to those substances and some less. Well, the frog's brain is going to get a pattern of these receptors responding. The frog is going to formulate a perception of the odor of the pond water. And if he's out on the grass and he smells that, he thinks, well, there's home, there's pond water. And he may orient to it and, try to get into the pond water. You could also imagine him smelling all kinds of things that are relevant to a frog's life. But you can see where there's a very complex patterns that receptor systems are responding to, even in an animal as simple as a frog. Imagine the patterns that are associated with primate smell or mammalian level smell, or like a dog smelling. Again, though, it is the number of receptors that respond and not the number of types. So we all have very similar number of types. It's just that the dog has many, many more under each type than we have. And here we see a schematic that shows the mapping of zones of receptor types to glomulary in the olfactory bulb. So on the right there you see a big, olfactory bulb. They're not quite that fat, but they have roughly that shape. You can see where in zone 2 they're showing, you have one type that's the black ones, then other types that are represented by the white ones. Well, you notice that all the ones of the black type are going to clusters of the glomulary on the olfactory bulb that are the same. So again, the pattern here, the bulb, is going to represent a mapping of different kinds of substances that are in the environment. So when those receptors are sensitive, they get mapped onto that area of the brain, or that area of the bulb. Once again, you see where sensory systems work by topographical mapping, like retinotopical mapping in your retina, like the mapping of frequencies, of sound. We now have a mapping of olfactory receptors responding. Now your brain takes this pattern and formulates a perception out of it, but the location of the neurons coming into the glomulary is a strong clue. When they're stimulated, it's a strong clue as to what kind of substance is out there. So you're going to have a two-dimensional map here. When these neurons are excited or not, that represents a pattern that can be interpreted as lilac smell or meat smell or pond water smell. And so each one of these substances is going to have a pattern of excitation and lack of excitation for different spots on the glomulary of the olfactory bulb. This information is then conveyed up into the system in your brain, which formulates the perception of the smell. And here you see this positioning displayed again in much more simpler form. So you have a olfactory bulb, and I think you all know what peppermint is. Here's peppermint. And when you smell peppermint, peppermint has certain chemicals in it that goes up in the mucosa, stimulates a certain set of receptors and not others. These are mapped onto your olfactory bulb in this location. So peppermint has a certain location, camphor has a location, and amyl acetate, I don't even know what that is, but it's obviously got a pretty strong smell. That's going to be located in that position. So the position, the mapping, represents receptor clusters into the glomeruli of the olfactory bulb, and different chemical substances will have different configurations when they stimulate the receptor system. And so there's a position associated with each substance. And that position is going to be a strong clue, for the brain to formulate a perception consistent with the position that's there. Okay, in the central nervous system, it's not that well known where smell goes, where smell information goes, compared to the other sensory systems. And this is because the pathways that come from the olfactory nerves, they spread out diffusely into the limbic system and into the frontal lobe. And it's not known exactly where they're going to be processed. It's clear that smells influence emotions, and so the input into the limbic system, which is mostly what you see here, is obviously very prominent. But then there's other things that are processed. I mean, we name smells, so they must be associated with the language center somehow. We orient, towards smells. We have a lot of interaction with them. Smell is something that has as big impact on our sensory perception as anything else. And we don't exactly know how this happens. And I think it's mostly because the olfactory system does not go into the thalamus. It doesn't go into the thalamus and then to the cortex. It goes directly into the old mammalian brain, the old limbic system that's sitting down here at the base of the brain. Here you see in different sort of color schematic some different components of the limbic system. The other thing to keep in mind is that the anterior commissure, there are three pathways that cross between the two hemispheres: the corpus callosum, the hippocampal commissure, and the anterior commissure. And the anterior commissure represents the olfactory system crossing over directly. It does not use the corpus callosum to cross, except perhaps in very high level processing of it, it might, but the primary crossover to the two hemispheres happens at a much more really primitive level, where the mammalian brain used to have crossovers. And the limbic system has its own interconnections across the two hemispheres that are separate from the rest of the brain. At any rate, the olfactory system goes directly into the limbic system. It engenders emotions directly. It's very hard to control these emotions generally, but it's very hard to control them in response to smell because we have no modulating function that's cortical. So when you smell something that smells bad, you have an emotional reaction to it that's usually appropriate, that causes you to avoid it and think of it as something disgusting, and that those feelings are associated with smells directly. Here we see the responses of different neurons in the frontal lobes to different kinds of odorants, different things that were smelled. Clearly there are neurons in the frontal lobes and the limbic system that are responding to smell stimuli, and there probably are discriminations that are being made there that are quite complex. Very little is known, though, about how exactly it works, and it has a lot to do with the fact that smell doesn't have a discrete location, in the frontal lobes that it goes to. It goes diffusely throughout the frontal lobes and somehow gets processed, and exactly where or how is very little known. Clearly you see here, though, that neurons are responding differently to different kinds of odorants. It probably works according to these patterns from the glomeruli and the patterns of the receptor types that are coming in there as a map. So you probably have a map, a two-dimensional depiction of an odorant, and neurons are responding to it. Not that probably unlike how they respond to sound, which has essentially a one-dimensional, essentially a serial layout of sound frequencies. Here with smell, you've got something like that, where you have a map that's pretty discrete once the receptors have responded, and the brain uses that information to formulate the perceptions. Okay, smell being so primitive, it can be manipulated by suggestions, by memories, things like that. So when you say somebody blindfolds you and puts a smell under your nose, and if it's ambiguous, it's not quite sure, you're not quite sure what it is, and somebody says, well, I put a flower under your nose, and you believe them, you will say and perceive that you smell a flower. Memories are very important for smell, and since smell goes right into the limbic system where a lot of memory processing occurs, smells often get attached to memories, and we have a lot of strong, reliable memories about how things should smell. This is obviously important for all organisms to do. I mean, if you don't remember, that the smell of, a rotten fruit is associated with, eating a rotten fruit and the bad experience, then you'll go ahead and eat fruit again that's rotten. Smell for primates that are near the ground, or mammals that are near the ground, like dogs and rats and cats and animals that are processing smells that are close to the ground. That's a very crucial discrimination for them. So when they're trying to figure out what to eat, it has a lot to do with how the object smells. For us, it has more to do with what the object looks like. We tend to look and examine objects we're going to eat. Now, if we do taste something and it tastes especially bad, we do remember that, though. But primates tend to look at objects, tend to look at fruit to see if it's ripe, rather than relying on smell to determine that. But memories are a big part of how smell works, and we tend to create perceptions using memories for how an object should smell, along with whatever stimulation we're getting. There have been a number of interesting studies recently examining whether people can smell each other and recognize each other by smell. These are extensions of research that's been done with rats, and basically where rats, they have such great smell that they do identify each other by smell. There's a lot of things that stimulate behavior in lower mammals that are smell-oriented. Pheromones, which is the smell components associated with these behaviors, are very commonly influential in animals like dogs. I remember a great case of a dog that was on the people's court, and according to the person bringing the case, there's this little dog that would climb over the fence of her house and impregnate her female dog, and she had to keep taking the dog to the vet to have it fixed, to have it, to undo this, because she didn't want this mutt, she had a purebred dog, she didn't want this mutt, making her female dog pregnant. And the claim of the defendant was that his dog was just too little to get over her fence, and that would just have been impossible for him to be the dog that did this. And so he didn't want to pay the damages, and he didn't want to pay the vet bills. And so she actually had photographs of this little dog climbing essentially over this giant fence to get at this female dog in heat. Now the male dog, when they smell a female dog, the pheromones of a female dog that's ready for impregnation, there's nothing that's going to stop that male. Their behavior is strongly determined by the motivational forces associated with the smell. And the idea was that maybe humans have some of these same kinds of behaviors associated with smell. In my opinion, these have not really panned out very well. They obviously get a lot of news play because they deal with men and women smelling each other, which I can't imagine anything more provocative than that. But they haven't really panned out, I don't think, in terms of abilities that we have to smell each other. And I don't think in my own behavior, I mean, people do have a smell, but I don't usually detect that smell unless I'm very close to them. I don't detect it from the same way my dog would. I mean, my dog can recognize the smell of me, 20 feet away. He can detect small molecules on the ground that I've walked over. Well, I don't have anywhere near that sensitivity, for other people. And so I think our sexual behavior and other behavior that might have been associated with interaction, according to smell, has been largely, vestigial. We may have done that more as primates, lower primates, and lower mammals, but now we don't do it hardly at all. You see dogs constantly smelling each other to detect, presumably, all kinds of things, gender, who the dog is. They probably recognize, each other by very distinctive smell differences. I don't think I do that with other people. Unless somebody has a really bad body odor, I don't ever notice that they smell at all, unless I get very, very close to them. But by then, I've already recognized them by vision and so on. There's also been some studies done of women and their menstrual cycles. It's been discovered that women do synchronize their menstrual cycles somewhat if they live together. It's always been kind of a mystery why this occurs. Why would the menstrual cycle be synchronized or even change at all, given the fact that people are just living together? Well, the theory is that smell mediates this, so that when women are different parts of the menstrual cycle, they can smell that difference in each other unconsciously, and then their menstrual cycles get synchronized because each of their limbic systems and their homeostatic systems that govern that get in synchronization. I don't think that's as prominent a finding as the sort of lore has come down to us. There have been inconsistent findings with that. The original studies that were done with it were just done by people who were responding with self-report questionnaires and things like that. And I don't know how you would know, if you were living in the dormitory with other women, I don't know how you'd know exactly when their menstrual cycles began and ended, so that you could say, yes, my menstrual cycle has been synchronized with this other person. I think you might know generally kind of like what's going on, but the idea that you could respond so specifically, well enough for a researcher to find out if they're synchronized strikes me as something that would be very hard to do just from self-report. You would need to have, some objective measure of the menstrual cycle being synchronized. And that wasn't done early on. It's been done later, and some synchronization has been discovered. I mean, I don't completely rule it out, but it's been much more controversial than it was from the early studies that were done. It was much, it's much more attractive to think that this kind of thing could happen than to be skeptical about it. And I think the findings the work still needs to be done to prove it. At any rate, though, that kind of synchronization could be done by smell. Smell does have inputs into the limbic system that help control things like menstrual cycles, and it would be very interesting if that actually did occur. I have a feeling, though, that smell is something that's so vestigial in humans that it doesn't play that role anymore. And in the same way that our menstrual cycles, have been liberated from our fertility. So, the dog, when the dog goes in heat, the dog wants to be impregnated. When women, human females, are ready to be impregnated when they're ovulating, they might not even know they're ovulating. There's a lot of women that have no idea they're ovulating when they are, and I don't find human males responding to pheromones coming out of the women at that time. It seems like it's hard, when couples are trying to get pregnant. It seems difficult, to synchronize sexual behavior, sexual activity with ovulation. They have to go through a process, measuring their temperature and doing all kinds of things, timing everything, so this might happen. The woman doesn't go into heat. She doesn't go into a period in which she's so hormonally stimulated that she knows she's ovulating and needs to get impregnated. Humans have become liberated from that. Maybe liberated isn't the right word. We're no longer bound to the menstrual cycle the same way that a dog or a rat is, and that no one exactly knows why that occurred, but it's probably related to sexual behavior generally in humans and enabled humans to be sexually active all through the menstrual cycle rather than just at one specific point. Smell, though, might it might be a factor. It's certainly a factor in sexual behavior and intimacy. There is you do recognize the smell of your spouse. There's smells associated with all kinds of human activity that are stimulating and that are related to all kinds of behavior, including sexual behavior. But I don't find it at the level that my family dog, responds to smell. For him, going outside in the world and smelling things is like a whole great adventure. And half the time when the dogs are outside, they just love to smell everything they can possibly can get a hold of. They love to roll around in things that are very pungent. I don't find that I have that desire to smell things or to roll around in something that smells particularly pungent. If anything, things that are pungent I find kind of aversive. I think smell too strong. For my dog, though, it's just smell heaven.